Our first speaker will be Janusz Bugajski, who is a senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. So welcome, Janusz. Great to have you back.
Thanks, Hella.
He is a jack of all trades. He has his own television show, and is it on the television or is it radio as well?
Television.
The Bugajski Hour and Bugajski Time, television shows which is shown in the Balkans. He has written no less than 19 books on Europe, Russia, and the transatlantic relationship, and is a columnist for several media outlets. I will just give you the title of his most recent book, published this year, Conflict Zones, the North Caucasus and Western Balkans Compared. Our next speaker will be Ariel Cohen. He is the Senior Research Fellow in Russian and Eurasian Studies and in International Energy Policy in the Douglas and Sarah Ellison Center for Foreign and National Defense Policy here at the Heritage Foundation. Ariel Cohen, who is also a doctor and doctor of law, has served as a consultant to both the executive branch and the private sector on policy towards Russia, Eastern and Central Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. And our final speaker today will be speaking from an authentically Ukrainian perspective. Irina Fedits, and we're very lucky to have her, is a visiting fellow here at the Heritage Foundation. She's an Atlas Corps fellow and in our Center for International Trade and Economics. She was previously a Kiev-based consultant for the Institute on Economic Research and Policy and holds an MA in Sociology from the National University of Kiev. So without further ado, over to our speakers. Janusz.
Thanks, Hella. Do you want me to come up there?
You may sit
Yeah.
or stand as you feel more comfortable.
I feel comfortable. Maybe I should stand. Why not?
Yes, why not?
Get a bit of exercise. Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's always good to be back at Heritage. It's been a few years now since I last spoke. I think it was about Russia at the time as well. 10 minutes, a lot to say and so little time to do it. So I'm going to be as brief as possible, concise as possible. And what I'd like to do is to briefly outline four things: Moscow's objectives, its fears, its solutions, and its options towards Ukraine. I think we're going to cover US policy options as well. Maybe Ariel was covering that, or we can talk about that in questions and answers. But let me focus on what I think Russia is up to. So let's begin. Moscow's objectives. I think these have been fairly clear for many years, but became more transparent during Putin's third presidential term. And I think Moscow's top priority is the reintegration of the former Soviet republics based on tighter economic links and culminating in a political and security pact within something called the Eurasian Union. Now, the Union itself is supposed to consolidate Russia's position as a major pole of power. Russia believes that we are in a multipolar world, and thereby can more effectively challenge the United States in competition, not only in Europe, but in other parts of the world. Now, Ukraine, I believe, is a pivotal component of the Kremlin's goals, as Ukraine's inclusion within this Eurasia Union would project Russia's power into Central Europe and wider Europe as a whole. And it will give the Eurasian Union a strong European component. Without Ukraine, the Eurasia Union becomes more of an Asian construct. At present, it's only Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Armenia that are on track to sign the Eurasia Union Treaty. Without Ukraine, as I said, it's going to be a fairly limited structure. Second point, Moscow's fears. I think the Kremlin's big fear is that Ukraine will spill out of its grasp with the victory of a pro-Western president, as well as a pro-Western government later this year in parliamentary elections, that will pursue closer ties with the European Union and with the United States. This would seriously damage Russia's agenda in assembling this neo-imperial Eurasia Union. Moscow is also anxious about democratic contagion from Ukraine and the reformist model in Ukraine that may challenge Putin's authoritarian system or may unseat allies in other post-Soviet states, including those that are, let's say, in line to join the Eurasia Union. Hence, in this respect, Kiev's success could become Moscow's failure, or let's say Putin's failure. In allegedly defending Ukraine against a perceived Western-sponsored takeover, Russia's leaders believe they are fighting to secure their own political survival, in other words, the continuity of the Putin system, as well as the territorial integrity of Russia itself. There is a fear in Moscow that contagion from Ukraine could pull some regions also away from the center, those regions that are dissatisfied with Moscow's policies. Third point, Moscow's solutions for Ukraine. Now, I think in order of preference, Moscow has pursued 4 different plans. I've outlined them as Plan A, Plan B, Plan C, Plan D. So let's start with Plan A. Ukraine integrated within international institutions dominated by Russia, including the Eurasia Union. And this has clearly failed. Given the Euromaidan protests and the commitment to, I think, the majority of the Ukrainian population to a European perspective. Plan B, a neutral Ukraine outside Western structures. The Kremlin, I believe, thinks this has also failed because of the EU association agreement. In other words, it cannot keep Ukraine in this sort of non-bloc, neutral, no man's land on the fence status. Plan C, a divided Ukraine outside the West with a separate East fully dependent on Russia. This has its advantages for Moscow, but it also bears significant costs, as I'll come to in a few minutes. And Plan D, which I think is one that is still a possibility and that Russia will pursue, is an unstable Ukraine, unable to qualify for either EU or in the future for NATO, and basically remains in this peripheral position on the edge of Europe. Now, given these plans, let me look at Moscow's options, what we've witnessed, I think, over the past few months. Because I think Moscow's objectives are clear, but its strategies and tactics are flexible, but fall into 4 options. Let me outline these. First of all, the political option. Swallow Crimea, wait until Western indignation subsides or distract it from Crimea, similarly to the partition of Georgia, Russia's partition of Georgia in August 2008, claim that the May elections in Ukraine are illegitimate or only partly legitimate, Putin then seeks a commitment to federalization in the Ukrainian constitution, which in effect for Russia means a divided state that blocks Kiev's international aspirations and prevents it from making progress towards the EU. Ukraine's government has clearly rejected any kind of referendum or federalization plan along Moscow's lines, thus undermining Putin's political option. Second option, the territorial option. Proxy separatism in southern and eastern Ukraine has been promoted by Moscow to test the prospects for division. It dispatched special forces and recruited assorted mercenaries for several regions to engineer conflict and establish secessionist governments. The Kremlin here, I think, has been testing one of 2 alternatives: creating a split state, much like Moldova, in which fully autonomous regions block central government decision-making, or Ukraine's further partition and partial absorption by Russia, in other words, continuation of the Crimea scenario. However, a military takeover and occupation of parts of mainland Ukraine would be very costly for Moscow and could actually deflate the nationalist imperialist euphoria that we've witnessed among large segments of the population in Russia since the annexation of Crimea. Additionally, the attempted separatist scenario has registered very limited success. I checked the actual, not just the oblasts, but the rayons in which they are active. Only a third of the rayons or districts in 2 out of 24 Ukrainian oblasts, in other words, Donetsk and Luhansk, have been affected by the Potemkin separatists. opinion polls clearly indicate that only a small minority of the Donbas population supports either federalization or let alone outright secession from Ukraine. The third option, destabilization. In the absence of sufficient public enthusiasm for autonomy or partition, Putin may decide to provoke violent civil conflict. And I think we're beginning to see this now, that would allegedly necessitate Russia's peacemaking intervention. This, of course, would be an invasion couched as humanitarianism. It is conceivable that a segment of the population in these two oblasts that I've outlined may favor the restoration of law and order by outside forces if chaos is instigated and if Kiev cannot exert its authority. And there we have a mixed picture. Russian military peacekeepers may be seen as the lesser of two evils, at least temporarily. But this strategy is extremely risky for Russia because I'm sure it will provoke significant armed resistance by Ukrainian forces outside of these two regions. And it will be seen as an outright invasion and will be condemned by the international community. My last option, which is the subversion option, which is a longer-term strategy that Putin may now favor, having failed largely in the separatist option and in the political option, I think is reminiscent of the post-Orange Revolution scenario. This would entail corrupting Ukraine's new officials, making deals with local oligarchs, promoting political divisions, waiting for the economic downturn to bite as Ukraine undertakes major structural and budgetary reforms, inciting social and regional unrest against the new government, and other forms of subversion to disqualify Kiev from pursuing a Western path, while simultaneously drawing the country closer to Russia through various incentives such as cheaper energy supplies. At the same time, of course, Western sanctions against Moscow would be largely lifted, and Putin would be praised in Western capitals for not pursuing the military option, while he continues with his shadow war against Russia's neighbors, particularly Ukraine. In conclusion, my very last point, I think it is imperative not only for Ukraine to hold clean presidential elections on Sunday and clean parliamentary elections later in the year, but for the new incoming Ukrainian administration to conduct effective structural and fiscal reforms with sufficient public support, move closer to Western institutions, maintain sufficient national cohesion during this process, and resist the temptations and pressures that are certain to come from Moscow over the coming months and years. And as I said, I haven't gone into the recommendations of what we should be doing, but maybe we can do that a little bit later. Thanks, Hella.
Thank you very much.
That's it.
Ariel, over to you.
Good morning. As Janusz Bugajski outlined quite a number of aspects of Russian policy, and of course I can talk Russia for hours, I would like to put the elections in Ukraine in perspective of Europe and what a challenge it is to the European security and to global security. And I firmly believe that we are witnessing a pivotal transformation of the post-Cold War world order. This comes from Mr. Putin's belief that Europe is weak, that the United States is not providing the necessary leadership, and that this is the time to challenge for the next maybe 2.5 years, to challenge the world order as Mr. Putin inherited when he took over from Boris Yeltsin in 1999. This is a challenge not just to reformat and reconfigure the world order and make Russia a strong pole in the alleged multipolar world, but specifically to bring down the relative power in that power equilibrium that also includes the rising China, the eventually rising India, and the BRIC countries that Russia, of course, is a part of. So putting it in a European perspective, what do we have? We have the sanctity of borders in Europe that were guaranteed by the 1975 Helsinki Accords. The Helsinki Accords, of course, that the Soviet Union was interested in securing, provided that the Baltic states were recognized, not by the United States, but by others. Baltic states were recognized as a part of the Soviet Union, and Eastern European countries were also recognized as a part of Eastern Bloc. The Helsinki Accords said that the borders will not be changed in Europe through violence. Next, the Paris Protocol of 1990, and then the Budapest Protocol that guaranteed Ukrainian security when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, the residual, the legacy nuclear weapons that it inherited from the Soviet Union. Today, of course, when all these instruments of international law are violated, this is very little that the Europeans, or for that matter, the United States, are doing, de facto recognizing the change that Russia is imposing through all the tools in its foreign policy toolbox. This is not just a military action that we saw in the Crimea, the military action that pioneered a whole new type of warfare that is especially relying on special forces, and not just special forces that not easily are identifiable with the military of the country that they sent these guys to take over a big swath of territory. The Crimea is bigger than some of European countries. And also the use of militias that are trained and sometimes led by special forces operatives or intelligence officers, as we saw in eastern Ukraine. The massive use of information warfare, especially mass media and propaganda. Invention of a whole new vocabulary, painting the Ukrainian leadership, mostly liberal nationalist, like Mr. Yatsenyuk, like the president of Ukraine, Turchinov, basically being liberals, liberal nationalists, painting them as Nazi sympathizers or fascists, but painting the whole Maidan protest as neo-Nazi. And that, of course, driving a wedge between the European public opinion and the Ukrainians. We witnessed, I just came back from London last week, had some conversation there that demonstrated to me the lack of commitment and the lack of interest in supporting Ukraine, not just from Germany, which I would expect because of the massive business relationship, because of the dependence of German industry and German utilities on the Russian gas, the relationship between Herr Schröder, the former chancellor, with Mr. Putin, and his capacity, Herr Schröder's capacity as the chairman of the Nord Stream company, which is the pipeline company to bring Gazprom gas to Germany, but also in Great Britain. And the Brits having sort of an imperial phantom pain or imperial complex, say, well, this is the Russian sphere of influence, this is a classic realpolitik approach, let them do in their backyard what they want, and let's not intervene with Ukraine. And the other camp in Europe is Sweden and Poland. You can go back, and the Russians do rhetorically 300 years back, saying, well, these countries are still smarting from the defeats the Russian Empire visited on them in the 18th century, including the partition of Poland and its disappearance from the map. No wonder they are trying to fight this war and use the Ukrainians as a battering ram and using Ukrainian activists as the cannon fodder against Russia. This is essentially the repeat, when I heard this in Britain, to me it was a repeat of the Moscow talking points, and there are people who are willing to repeat these talking points, unfortunately. For the US, it's more complicated. First, we have the first post-Europe presidency. I don't think Mr. Obama has any particular affinity or warm place in his heart towards Europe. Europe is just one piece on the map from where colonial occupiers have come in the past. I think this administration, if it's preoccupied with any geopolitical matters, it's first and foremost Asia, it's China, but also the Middle East. And as much as this administration is trying to pivot away from the Middle East comes back and sort of grabs it by its ankles and draws it back into it. So that's a second priority. With that, Ukraine has become a tertiary priority, if not lower, on this food chain of priorities that the administration can deal with. To wit, we had a couple of vice presidential visits to Ukraine. We had the Assistant Secretary for Europe. We did not have massive involvement, on the level of Secretary of Defense or even the President, of the President until now, but Secretary of Defense, I think, visited. And before the events in Ukraine for 6 years, and Helle is my witness, I try to raise the alarm. We were neglecting the former Soviet area. And I talked incessantly about that. And of course, it's very frustrating. But the administration really did not see former Soviet Union, Western CIS, and the Caucasus and Central Asia as any kind of priority. There were no presidential visits. There were no significant discussion of what American policy is in that part of the world. And I'm being told by senior US and foreign officials that they do not perceive any strategy towards that. People thought in the framework of the reset towards Russia that this will be a signal of benevolent neglect. In fact, because the political cultures are so different, it was not. It was perceived as weakness, it was perceived as vacuum, and vacuum exists in geopolitics and in foreign policy in order to be filled by those who can fill it. So the US now is deliberating whether the first wave of sanctions that are primarily personal sanctions are sufficient. The fact that Moscow did not invade, is somebody going to say that this is a great achievement of the US and European policy? Yes, Mrs. Merkel intervened with Vladimir Putin in the language he understands, German, a number of times, or maybe in Russian, because she speaks Russian, I understand. And the fact that there was no invasion is a plus. However, as I mentioned before, the whole new toolbox, the whole new pattern of engagement that includes propaganda, includes economic pressure, includes the price of gas. The price of gas for Ukraine now, after the Yanukovych-Putin agreement, Yanukovych-Medvedev agreement was renounced, the Kharkiv agreement was renounced, the price was in 270 range. It's 486. It's the highest price in Europe for natural gas. And when we give money to Ukraine, the IMF bailout and the European bailout packages, a good chunk of this money will go to the treasury in Moscow to pay for, to Gazprom, to pay for that gas. Kind of a perverse way of doing business here. Ukraine, unless we send a very strong message and have a policy commitment that goes beyond the immediate crisis, Ukraine is only the first stage in this reconfiguration of a power balance in Europe and in the world. What happened in terms of the post-Cold War arrangement, post-91 arrangement, and even post-World War II arrangement, when the protection of co-ethnics, people who speak the same language or come from the same ethnic stock as you, is a permissible reason to intervene militarily, like in the Crimea or in eastern Ukraine. What if China decides that the same approach can apply to Taiwan or to other places where overseas Chinese live? Would that allow Her Majesty's government to send the British Navy to protect English-speaking South Africans? Oh, I'm sorry, all South Africans speak English. Or
Speak another language as well.
yeah, but people spoke another language in the Crimea as well. They spoke Ukrainian, they spoke Crimean Tatar. Does it mean that Russia can send now the Russian Navy to Brooklyn, New York to protect Russian-speaking population there? No, of course not. But where do you draw the line? We're in uncharted waters here. And I think the Europeans need to recognize that their commitment to Ukraine and to the current order in Europe should include a clear pathway to Ukraine. It doesn't have to be tomorrow, not even a day after tomorrow, but a pathway that brings Ukraine into the European Union. Maybe in 10 years, maybe in 15 years. Things take a long time, but if you can bring Albania or Serbia into European Union, you certainly can bring Ukraine. You would expect the Europeans now to revisit their military budgets. I was told that only UK, Estonia, and Greece have a military budget of 2%. US has 2% of GDP. We have 3.5% in that range of GDP. The Europeans need to wake up and understand that this military welfare they receive from the United States cannot continue. In terms of the Ukrainian policy after the elections, a lot of folks are expecting Mr. Poroshenko to win either in the first round or the second round, but there's a lot of things Poroshenko has to do, if it's Poroshenko. Whoever the next president, he or she need to do. Ukraine was stolen blind by the Yanukovych regime. There's speculations in the media that up to $100 billion were extorted or laundered by the Yanukovych people and his family, his business associates. Even if it's half of that, in a country of the GDP of about 200 billion a year, it is a tremendous amount. And the economic reform, I am a senior advisor to the U.S.-Ukraine Business Council and was an American co-chair of the economic section of the U.S.-Ukraine Policy Dialogue. The prescriptions are there forever. I mean, this is something we can talk about now for 10 years or 15 years, what Ukraine needs to do. We all know that. Make the economy less dependent on energy. Ukraine was, at some point, it was calculated, it generated 10% of the German GDP, but consumed as much energy as Germany. Make it more transparent, make the bureaucracy more transparent, increase salaries, but fight corruption, streamline regulation, etc. The security forces demonstrated that they cannot control the territory of the state. This is a sign, this is a symptom of a failing state. If the security forces could not deal with several hundreds, maybe low thousands of separatists in eastern Ukraine, led by maybe a few hundred Russian operatives, it is clear that there need to be a very serious reform and modernization of the Ukrainian security apparatus and armed services, and the corrupt people who are related and connected to Moscow, who took money from foreign countries, have to be purged out of the security services. Finally, Ukraine, the central government in Kiev after the elections will have to find the right way to balance the language issues and culture issues with people in the East. I'm not here to give prescriptions, but the wedge issues like the language that Russia exploited in a cynical way, they need to be addressed, and everybody needs to understand where people stand. Finally, going back to Europe and the policy package, the German intelligence already leaked a couple of reports what the Russians are doing in Bulgaria. The president of Bulgaria went out and made a very alarming speech about what the Russians are doing in that country, and that's just a beginning. The Europeans need to work with Central and Eastern European countries, with their governments, and as well as focus on the Baltic states. It is good we sent some tripwire troops, very few. There'll be 600 Marines rotating in and out of Eastern Europe, including the Baltic states. That's very, very little. It's a signal, but it's a weak signal. So to deal with local separatists or people who are funded by foreign governments should be a priority, both for the security services in those countries and for the media, who has to be careful how they filter, how they analyze, how they understand different messages. For example, I mentioned Bulgaria, the shale gas issue in Bulgaria was killed. They put a moratorium. Why? Because Russia is interested in building a nuclear reactor there, and there's a lot of reports and rumors about somebody paying the quote-unquote environmental activists to fight against shale, which would be an alternative source of energy. And just to finish on energy, Ukraine desperately needs to diversify its net energy sources, including, for example, bringing LNG, liquid natural gas, into the south of Ukraine from sources other than Russia. There's a global market in LNG. Turkey is not allowing that right now, and this is something the US government and the European governments could address to convince our Turkish NATO allies to give a hand to Ukraine in a period of a humanitarian crisis and a security crisis. So things like that, creative policies to shore up Ukrainian independence, combined with a clear commitment by the new leadership that will be elected to get Ukraine back on its feet, make it modern, make it transparent, make it attractive for foreign investment and for domestic investment, and then, God willing, we'll be in a better world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ariel. Irina, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning. I just probably give you a more detailed picture of presidential elections in Ukraine and of the people who run in these elections and what are their objectives and who are these people. So, as you know, the presidential elections in Ukraine were set up after the former president ran away after the long period of protests, and so and the date of the elections was decided back in February this year. So, but in this time when we still didn't know about Crimea annexation, we didn't expect this event that happened in eastern Ukraine now. So this date has been set up back in winter, when still all this, probably the events or the situation and agenda was very different from what we have now. And after this long period of protests, there is a kind of dilemma for Ukrainian voters now, because for one hand, they could. One of the goals of the protest was to have new faces in Ukrainian politics, new people who could lead Ukraine into the European integration, into better economic and situation and structural reforms. But on the other hand, the two people that are most popular as likely presidential candidates are the representatives of the old politics, as we call them. So the person who is mostly likely to win, Petro Poroshenko, he used to work back in Viktor Yushchenko's government after Orange Revolution. And you probably know Yulia Tymoshenko, who used to be a prime minister of Ukraine. And she is a runner-up, but with a very big difference. The latest polls show that Poroshenko is likely to win in the first round of elections because now he scores around 55% of the votes. And according to Ukrainian laws, in order to win in the first round, you have to gain more than 50% of the votes. And Yulia Tymoshenko has only 10% of votes, and she's on the second place after him. Also, the list of the possible candidates is quite long. I have about 20 people here, and 2 of them are actually representatives of these Maidan activists, so of these protesters who protested against Yanukovych regime. And these 2 people are quite opposite, I would say, from one another, because altogether they gain only about 3% of preliminary votes according to sociological polls. And one of them is Olga Bogomolets. She is a doctor and activist. She has her own health clinic in Kiev, and during the protests, she was really helpful because she helped to organize all these makeshift hospitals to help the wounded, to help people, and she grew her popularity because of participating in this protest. And the other person is Viktor Yanukovych, who is the leader of a kind of militia, a radical group who used to fight on the streets of Kiev when there were most violent protests, and now they have morphed into a political party and tried to get political votes, but they don't really have this much popularity because maybe during the revolution time it's nice to have a guy in a mask near you who can protect you and to rush and to go to this parliament or presidential palace. But when the peaceful time comes and when you need reforms, you need a person who can lead the country. These radicals from revolutionary times, they are not trusted very much, and that's why this other person has only 1% of votes according to preliminary polls. And one more characteristical feature of the polls is that the eastern region of Ukraine, where the people live who used to vote for Viktor Yanukovych and his party, the former president of Ukraine, now they seem very disappointed or lost. They don't really know who to vote for, or they're like full of apathy and don't know how they should vote in these elections. The polls show that more than 60%, actually 63% of the voters in the eastern part of Ukraine say that they either won't vote or they are not decided yet. So they don't have any candidate who they could support. But if you look at this list of the candidates, there are actually 2 persons running who represent this former presidential party, the Party of Regions. One of them used to work in government, one of them used to be a governor of one of the regions. So theoretically, we could say that they could be represented by these 1 or 2 candidates. But still, these people seem to be disappointed with the former government, former party, and still don't know, haven't found yet anything new, anything that they think that who could represent them. So, and yes, so this is the eastern region now is the most undecided, and the most probably the turnout will be the least. But also because in the eastern Ukraine, as you know, there are now fights with the separatists. Several cities, several micro regions of this oblast are controlled by the separatists. And so Ukrainian election committee estimates that not all of them will be able to vote. And those who want, they could travel to other parts of Ukraine. But as you know, all these cities are controlled. They have all these checkpoints, so it could be really dangerous to travel to other parts of Ukraine. Also in Crimea, there is an opportunity for people from Crimea who want to vote in Ukrainian elections to travel to the nearest oblast, to the bordering other regions of Ukraine, and vote there. But not from 2 million people in Crimea, only 6,000 people registered to vote in other oblasts. And it could be really dangerous too, because there is a kind of interstate border now between Crimea and the rest of Ukraine. And these people who travel outside to vote this Sunday, they could be, I don't know, perceived as some kind of traitors or too much pro-Ukrainians, and they could not be let in back again, so they could lose their homes, not be disconnected with their families. So probably they could decide that it will be safer for them just to stay at home and not to travel to some other parts of Ukraine just to vote, because they may not come back. And and now speaking, these are like obstacles to these elections, and about the issues that are going to be that are raised by the candidates. So when it all started, the main issue was probably European integration of Ukraine, because the protests were starting about it, and then economic issues, because really Ukraine now needs economic reforms, and also anti-corruption, because as you know, these protests were very much against the previous political conglomerate that was very much corrupted and involved in all these stealing schemes. But now, with the separatists in the east and Crimea occupied, the agenda has shifted a bit quite to this issue of protecting sovereignty of Ukraine, of protecting people's lives, of modernizing the army. And yesterday there was an incident in Ukraine that showed that how much we need to modernize our army, to equip it, and actually to get better prepared, because 16 Ukrainian soldiers were killed in an attack by this pro-Russian or Russian team that attacked them in the night. And so there was our biggest loss during all this war, or all this fights with the separatists. And so it's now a big point for the new president to do something about the army, to modernize it and to equip it properly, and to manage these fights with the separatists. And also, I would like to finish by saying that on this day, May 25th, there will be not only presidential elections in Ukraine, but actually also elections, mayoral elections in Kiev and in Odessa, among other cities, and European Parliament elections in the European Union. And Kiev elections are important because, as you know, Kiev was the center of this protest, where this protest took place, and it is considered that how people in Kiev vote, then the similar way will be voted in Ukraine, for example, in the next parliamentary elections. So who comes to power in Kiev, then they are likely to come to power in Ukraine. And in the European elections, yes, we will see who wins in these elections, and this will probably determine the European stance on Ukraine in the future. And there are speculations that probably there is information that Putin now supports European far-right parties that are connected with him, and so these elections could actually lead to the bigger percentage of these far-right parties in European Parliament, which could change policy into less support from European Union to Ukraine. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Irina, if I could just, I think maybe ask the first question here of you. What do you hear from home, from your family and your friends? How strongly do people feel about the importance of this election, after all that has happened since last November, with the protests and the Russian grab of Crimea and all that? How do people feel about it? Are they nervous? Are they determined, or what's the mood?
Well, mood is quite determined, because this is our early elections. We did not expect our elections sooner than next year, but still the turnout is expected to be the highest in the probably previous 10 years, because people are really quite decided to take part in these elections, and even the youth, which is usually the younger people are not that active in elections, in politics. But now, with students being one of the main groups of the protests and all these NGOs that consist of young people that do all these anti-corruption initiatives, they're controlling actually these candidates. They were demanding from the candidates to publish their tax declarations online and to make all their programs transparent, publicly accessible. And so yes, it seems that people are quite determined to elect a new president. And and then they hope that this new person will be able to lead Ukraine into like the future and to protect it from all these separatist movements.
Thank you. At least that sounds like a good sign. Let's open it up to questions from the audience. Those who have a question, if you can please identify yourself by your name and your affiliation, we will capture this for our website. Yes, we have one in the back there.
Hello, my name is So Iwahara from Marubeni Corporation. We're a Japanese trading company. And I'd like to ask a question about sanctions and what we could expect in the next phase. I know that we've been looking at some of the Obama administration's sanctions towards individuals and certain companies within Russia. But there's a lot of talk about how the next phase may cover certain industries. So wanted to see what conditions would have to be there in order for the U.S. government to move into that next phase of covering entire industries under sanctions. If you could give us some sort of indication of how that might go forward in the next phase.
Maybe I can kick off and Ariel can kick on. I've always been a bit wary about not so much the sanctions, but the objectives we're trying to achieve. We keep hearing from our administration and some European governments about de-escalation. Now, what does that ultimately mean? Does that mean that Russia can keep Crimea but not attack eastern Ukraine? Does that mean it can continue to disrupt clandestinely and through proxies the Ukrainian state, as long as it doesn't do it directly? I'm not clear about the objectives, and I don't think they've been specified. Okay, that said, the sanctions that have been implemented thus far are limited. I wouldn't say they haven't had an impact. In some places, they have had an impact in terms of targeting some individuals that are involved, for example, in the South Stream, development of the South Stream business. The next stage of sanctions, and again, I think Russia is probably trying to avoid these. It's one of the calculations that is going into Putin's frequent declaration that he's withdrawing troops from the Ukrainian border. In other words, sectoral sanctions that would hit, presumably, Russian business much harder, energy sector, banking, financial services, metallurgy, other exports. The question is, will we be able to get, our administration be able to get the Europeans along? As you know, what Russia has done over the past 20 years is not so much go global, but has tied us into its economic transactions, into its economic networks, into its economic web. Western companies, Western energy companies, Western banks. We thought, we were getting for 10 years that by tying Russia into these networks, we would so-called civilize it, make it more democratic, make it less imperial. It's actually had the opposite effect, that it's restricted us from imposing sanctions on Russia when it behaves badly towards its neighbors, because it would hurt our economies. So I'm not sure how far we're willing to go, even if there were to be an outright Russian military intervention in Ukraine. I personally think Putin is trying to avoid it, but I wouldn't take it off the table. One of the options I specified is that they could create so much chaos through terrorism and sabotage, political disruption, infrastructure breakdown, blockages, all sorts of things they could do in certain parts of eastern Ukraine, and then claim they're coming in on a humanitarian peacekeeping mission to restore law and order. So and at that point, we have to consider what would be the reaction, the sanctions reaction. I have other points to make. I think we should move beyond sanctions, but let me turn it over to the others.
Ariel?
Well, the extent to which Western business does not want sanctions has been demonstrated today. Mrs. Merkel, after all the criticism, showed up in St. Petersburg at the Economic Forum, and I'm told was the guest of E.ON, the big German energy company that is a major partner of Gazprom and Russian energy. That tells me a lot. The leader of the most powerful country in Europe went to Moscow, gave a speech about how business relations with Russia need to be expanded, and did not mention Ukraine. So that is, ladies and gentlemen, an important signal that for now, the compromise looks like this. There will be no full-scale military invasion, 20th century style, with tank columns into Ukraine, probably because the Russians came to a conclusion, correctly in my book, that they have the most powerful tools and levers to influence Ukrainian politics. More powerful than the West, more powerful than Europe, and that they assessed correctly that Mr. Obama and Mrs. Merkel, the two principal leaders of North America and Europe, will not pursue a confrontation and will not incur a price from Russia that Russia is not willing to pay. Yes, there may be no military invasion, but at the same time, I will not put it past the Germans to repeat their position back in 2008 that Ukraine should not be in NATO. I would not be surprised that the signals are going to Moscow that the West will swallow, will not formally recognize, but will acquiesce to the Crimea in the Russian hands. I just gave, 2 days ago, a presentation to a bunch of American military officers, and the majority in the room said, oh, clearly Putin is going to keep the Crimea. Well, it's not a bad deal. He didn't lose any people there. He took it. He bluffed and blustered, put some troops on the border, grabbed the Crimea, and as I pointed out before, it is a process, not an event. And if we don't do sanctions, and I think after Merkel going, the sanctions by the US alone, without Europe, let alone without China, Japan, other principal Russian trading partners, are meaningless. Are meaningless. US doesn't buy Russian oil. The Russian oil is traded in global markets. Russian gas goes to Europe, and they increasingly will be doing LNG and sell it to China. So where else we can hurt them? Yeah, if we could disrupt the banking payments and mess up the finances on the level we did vis-a-vis Iran, Russians would hurt, but don't forget, this is a country that survived the civil war in which they lost 5 million people, Stalin's terror in which they lost over 20 million people, World War II, 74 years of a horrible communist regime. Sanctions? I don't think this is really serious.
Okay, thank you. Yes, question here in the front row.
My name is Dr. Michael Krause. I head a consultancy for security. My question is a very specific one, and it goes like this. There is a pending sale of 2 amphibious ships by France, and it's likely that France will sell. My model is July 1914, where Churchill arbitrarily, on his own, decided not to give the already paid-for dreadnoughts to the Ottoman Empire at the time. What are your thoughts on France and the specific example, and particularly for Ariel to say, from a U.S. standpoint, what could we do, should we do, to prevent that kind of a sale?
This administration probably will not do much. I think the concept of leadership from behind assumes that countries make their own decisions. They assume that a nuclear power, France, is an adult and can decide the things on its own. I personally wrote, I'm on record, before Ukraine, before Sochi, before the Magnitsky Act, I'm on record not once and not twice opposing the sale of Mistral, because Mistral, the helicopter-carrying amphibious assault ship, is a tool of power projection. The Russians want it for the Black Sea and for the Baltic Sea, for Black Sea and for the Pacific, and it is clear that ships like that vastly increase the punch and the rapidity of deployment of expeditionary forces. The then commander, the ex-commander of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, said that if we had the Mistral, we would have done in 2 hours what it took us 2 days in Georgia in 2008. So if the French want to enhance Russian power projection, they'll go ahead with that, and we probably will express our regret or concern, not beyond anything beyond that. What are we going to do? Not to buy French cheese?
We did that once before.
If I could just add, what we're talking about, I think, is the 21st century version of what Lenin's purported remark that captors will sell the rope, we'll be able to sell the rope for the captors to hang themselves. So it's sort of 21st century version, and I think it's indicative of not only a lack of a short-term response to what Russia is doing, but a long-term strategy in terms of how to counter Russia's neo-imperial project throughout the greater Europe. And something that I think we had a strategy during the Cold War, we had a strategy in the immediate post-Cold War period also to bring these countries into NATO, to expand the transatlantic alliance, to strengthen the European Union. And I think we lost sight of the target. We declared too quickly that the mission was accomplished. We didn't complete the picture of bringing the greater Europe, the whole Europe, the wider Europe into these transatlantic structures. We were distracted by other events. We withdrew in many respects from Europe. And of course, Europe itself is partly to blame because of the fact that it's been so focused on its own internal questions. It hasn't sufficiently paid attention, other than a few exceptions, as Hella mentioned, Sweden, Poland, Baltic states, hasn't really paid attention to those neighbors. And those neighbors can be extremely destabilizing to the NATO project, to the Central European project. So, following up what Ariel was saying, I'm just wondering at what point we will draw a red line and stick to it. In other words, is it an attack on Latvia? How would German business react to a subversion of Latvia, where there is a sizable Russian and Russian-speaking population, or Estonia? Both NATO, of course, countries and European Union countries. And I wouldn't discount the possibility that Putin will become emboldened by the fact that he hasn't been sufficiently appropriately punished and through his actions vis-à-vis Crimea, and act more boldly elsewhere. One other thing I'd like to add on Crimea, this is only the beginning. In other words, Russia may have swallowed Crimea, but the mood amongst the Tatars in particular in Crimea is going to become increasingly anti-Russian. There's already several announcements of a new emirate being created, in other words, a jihadist emirate in Crimea, and the possibility that Russia will have expanded the North Caucasus insurgency. The distance between North Caucasus and Crimea is not very large. A lot of Tatar youths, I think, are going to become militant. Some of them have been fighting in Syria. I'm sure the links with the jihadists and the Salafists in North Caucasus will increase. And if you have a combination of radical Islam and a fight for national independence, because this is not traditional Russian land. If you look as far back in history, it's traditional Crimean land, Crimean Tatar land. So Russia has bitten off something that will increasingly poison its system.
Okay, I think Ariel had
Yeah,
one
just
more
real
comment, and we'll
quick,
get to
besides
question over
the
here.
Middle Eastern-funded Salafis, Wahhabi sects, militants, the Russians may actually gain themselves something they didn't think about, and that is a relationship between Tatars, Crimean Tatars, and the religious orders in Turkey known as tarikat. These are Sufi orders, but when push comes to shove, they fought in the Caucasus for 200 plus years, the Naqshbandis and others. So there are currents and movements in the Muslim world, including nearby in Turkey, and because the Crimea had been Turkish territory only 250 years ago, so there are people in Turkey who are seriously thinking about that. And I think because it's a very small population, maybe it's not such a big deal like North Caucasus, but I agree with Janusz, they may get on their hands some kind of resistance. I'm not sure which. I'm not sure if it's going to be very militant or not, but the Crimean Tatars resenting the deportation of 1944, that all of them were shipped to Central Asia, and 30 to 40% of them died in deportation. They do not harbor kind thoughts about their relationship with the Russians.
Okay, let's go to the question over here on the side.
Michael Sokyu from the Ukrainian Congress Committee. Excellent presentation by all three panelists, and I appreciate it. I have a question in terms of semantics in all of this and the optics of all of this. Ukraine, in a sense, in the past 2 months since Crimea has been losing what is called the propaganda war. Russia and its disinformation, whether it's from RT, Russia Today, whether it's obviously any of its other correspondents throughout the world, is just disinforming the truth about the situation of what is happening in Ukraine. And rightly so, as Janusz had pointed out, only 2 rayons in 2 of the oblasts in Ukraine have any type of separatist type movements occurring in it. How does the United States embrace, in terms of optics, embrace the new Ukrainian president and the new Ukrainian government after these particular elections? Not so much so just for propping up the Ukrainians themselves, but also obviously as a little hit to Putin and to Moscow. And as a follow-up question to something that was asked earlier, in terms of sanctions, if they're not enough, what is enough? What should we be doing against Putin and against the Russian government? Thank you.
Shall I start?
Yeah, but go ahead.
A lot of territory there. I don't know if I can answer
Yeah,
everything,
yeah,
but
that's it.
you're absolutely right about disinformation, but also language use. This term that's now crept in that everybody uses, pro-Russian forces. What does that mean? There's a lot of Russians in Ukraine and a lot of Russian speakers in Ukraine that want to be part of a united Ukrainian state. Not all Russians in Ukraine support Putin. Not all Russians in Russia support Putin. So to say pro-Russian is very misleading. I personally call them pro-Kremlin separatists. In other words, they've been aided and abetted, although Putin is trying this sort of deniability aspect now. In other words, I'm not responsible, they did it, which reminds me a little bit of what Milosevic used to do with his war criminals. But so yes, it creeps into language, and we have to be extremely careful to clean it up. Not to mention this whole barrage about Ukrainian fascism, anti-Semitism, which actually there's been some good articles. This is being imported from Russia. If you look at what's happening in Russia, in terms of attacks on minorities, attacks on Muslims, anti-Semitic propaganda, the use of nationalism by Russia. This is much more prominent in Ukraine. It's a factor in Ukraine, but it's relatively marginal on a par, I'd say, with much of Europe. Probably less, actually, given what you were saying about the elections coming up for the European Parliament, much less than in other countries. The other part, maybe I'll leave to Ariel what we should do to welcome the new Ukrainian president. My point about sanctions is they are insufficient. And I have a paper which I published just now in Hungarian Review, in which I look at 3 areas. If we are serious in dealing with the Putin project, then not only sanctions, but we have to make what I call imperial indigestion. In other words, Ukraine, other countries that are threatened or swallowed, partially swallowed by Russia, they have to be made, Russia has to be made as uncomfortable as possible in trying to digest them. Ukraine needs to be properly armed. It needs a proper defense force, proper police force, proper intelligence. The Russian agents need to be cleaned out. There's a whole range of questions and reforms that need to be conducted that we should be offering to the Ukrainian government. Secondly, and I think even more importantly, well, actually, to follow this up, also the program of, let's say, properly defending all the NATO members along Russia's borders, Baltic states, Poland, Romania, and so on and so forth. We've started this, but I don't think it's enough. Our bases need to be there. Troops need to be on the ground there. They do not still believe in Latvia, Estonia, Poland, that if the Russians come in, they certainly don't believe that the Germans are going to get involved, but they don't even believe that the Americans would become involved. Lastly, my last point, I think it's essential, if we are serious about what Russia's up to, and if we don't want to see a continuous repeat of what I call this shadow war that Russia's engaging in against its neighbors, ultimately we need to weaken the Putin regime. This Putin regime needs to be replaced by a democratic alternative. We have to weaken the Putin structure. We have to help the alternative Russia, but we also have to help independence movements, democratic sovereignty movements, regions of Russia that do not look to Moscow as their savior. Far from it. They've seen the annexation of Crimea as weakening federal funding for their regions. There's a lot of dissatisfaction around Russia, and I personally believe that one of the reasons Putin hits out externally is that he's concerned about the internal situation. As part of our democratic program, democracy building is also building of strong democratic regions that can create a real federation in Russia. Russia keeps talking about creating a federation in Ukraine. Russian federation is not a federation. It's a centralized authoritarian structure. Let's have a real federation in Russia. Let's support the regions. I think this should be part of our policy, our Western policy.
That's quite an answer there.
That's a great answer.
If I'm not mistaken, I think they kicked out the National Endowment for Democracy.
Well, you could
but maybe for the same
kick
reason.
you out the door, go through the windows.
Ariel, and maybe Irina afterwards can talk about what Ukrainians would like to see when they have a new president. What would be a meaningful signal from us? Ariel, why don't you have a...
Yeah, in terms of our support, I would be encouraging, I would embrace a democratically elected leader, I would support with conditionality the IMF bailout package for Ukraine, otherwise Ukraine will collapse economically. But we have seen that movie before. We've seen it in 2004, we've seen it after that. The mobilization of a state, including Ukraine, for comprehensive political and economic reform is not an easy task. And so far from, maybe these people are hiding somewhere, but the regular actors, the regular players in the political, Ukrainian political world do not strike me necessarily as great leaders of economic reform a la Estonian Mart Laar, or people who can rearrange massive bureaucracies and make them transparent and non-corrupt. This is a tall task, and I think Ukraine would need to have a consensus that it's absolutely need to be done as a matter of national survival. If we had leaders here who understand that, they could have communicated that to their Ukrainian counterparts. But you really are at the point where if Ukrainians will not do this work, any amount of Western aid will be wasted, stolen, and misallocated. The Ukrainian diaspora, the Hromada, needs to mobilize, and I have not seen that mobilization before the recent events. In the recent events, there's a little bit more of it, but again, in order to implement the reforms that are necessary in the security apparatus, in the military, in the economic realm, this is something Central Europe and the Baltic states went through 20 years ago. Ukraine wasted 20 years not doing that. So yes, there's a yearning to be part of Europe, but there's no hard work that had been done to implement necessary steps in a variety of government branches that are necessary. And also, Ukraine has to push back on propaganda and redefine and push back on these definitions of Ukraine as neo-fascist or Bandera or whatever. This is not helping the image of Ukraine in Europe. This is not helping the image of Ukraine here. I think the Russian narrative is absolutely wrong. There's no question about it. But they're doing it. And Ukrainians are not really mobilized in that realm.
I'll probably add something. So now the work of the new president and new government in Ukraine is going to be a bit tricky, a little bit similar to the post-Orange Revolution times, because now after Yanukovych fled, so the parliament changed the constitution in order to make the president less powerful, to not to him or her become as much as dictator or authoritarian leader as Yanukovych was. So now the president has limited control over government, and it means that, for example, if Poroshenko comes to power, which will probably be, he becomes a president, but he will control over only the defense, internal, and like ministries in the government. And the economic bloc, all other social policy, economic, all other ministers will be still controlled by the current government, and they need to be approved by the parliament. So the same thing we did have back in 2005 when the new president was elected with limited powers, and it led actually to the conflicts between the president and the prime minister, and probably this was one of the reasons that we didn't see all this much expected reforms implemented, because much energy, much effort was wasted into this almost personal political conflict that didn't even have nothing to do with political issues, only with the balance of power, who is more powerful, who can have more control. And now in Ukraine we can have the same situation, but on the other hand, our people, civil society, seems to be more aware of these conditions, and now we have public movements, NGOs, that set it as their goal to control politicians, to make them more accountable, to make them actually implement these reforms that people are pushing for. And so maybe this time it will depend much from the civil society, from the people who supported this protest back in winter, now to make these politicians who they elect actually to implement these ideas, these goals for which people were protesting and standing for. So that's basically it.
Okay. Any more questions? Well, yeah, one over here.
Thank you. My name is Kobayashi with Kyodo News of Japan, and I would like to say something about the upcoming G7 summit. The G7 summit coming up next week, and we presume the G7 leaders may be releasing a statement which would be critical of the Putin's movement policies in any ways. Do you think such a movement, pressure by the G7 leaders, would affect President Putin's policies against Ukraine in the near future? And if it does, I'm wondering if you could explain how. Thank you.
All right, you're straight. Well, I'm not sure I understood what exactly you're trying to clarify in terms of behavior of the leaders. Can you sort of focus?
So how the pressure by G7 leaders would or could affect President Putin's policies toward Ukraine in the near future?
I am not sure there is currently pressure displayed that could affect the change of behavior. I think one of the things we talked about here is that probably Mr. Putin's advisors made a financial calculation how much it was going to cost for Russia to pay for parts of Ukraine if they occupied them. And the estimates are in tens of billions of dollars. They decided that it's better not to occupy because Russia would not be able to pay for it. But in terms of pressure, short of a major disruption of financial system such as interbank transfers and wires, sanctions against Russian banks, essentially, against Russian banking system. I do not see the level of pressure that can change Russian behavior in the areas that Mr. Putin and his entourage, his inner circle, decided that this is of vital importance to Russia. The problem is, and I've been in Russia many times, I listened to the narrative. The problem I see is that many in the top levels of Russian foreign policy come from the Soviet system. There was no massive rejuvenation of the system. There was no elite change. And they believe that NATO is a strong organization and it crawls towards Russian borders, and they want to get Ukraine into NATO somehow to, engage Russia in a military confrontation. They believe that the Arab Spring type of civil unrest is instigated by the West through Facebook and Twitter and through the internet. Mr. Putin is on record saying that CIA either invented or runs internet, which I don't think is the case. There's a lot of electronic monitoring going on in all parts of the world, but not necessarily by that agency. In any event, what I'm saying is that you need to have a clear idea where the pressure points are and then apply decisive pressure if you want to try to change somebody's international behavior. And even then, there are no guarantees. There are countries that were under sanctions for a long, long time, and I'm not even convinced that a country that is much weaker than Russia, like Iran, is going to change its strategic commitment to acquire nuclear weapons. I'm not convinced, or become a threshold state. I'm not convinced you can do it with sanctions, and certainly not on the level of rather weak pro forma sanctions that we're witnessing now. Thank you.
If I could just add about the G7, I hope the Japanese Prime Minister raises the occupation and annexation of the northern territories by Russia, Japan's northern territories, because it seems to me that there are many disputes between Russia and its neighbors that haven't been resolved, this being one of them. And I know it's heats up at various occasions. I agree with Ariel. In terms of sanctions or any other policy, we need clear objectives. And at least with Iran, there are clear objectives, no nuclear weapons. When we had South African sanctions, at least we had clear objectives, end of apartheid. I'm not sure what our objectives are vis-a-vis Putin. We want to punish somebody that then we want to work with. That doesn't make sense to me. I think the only alternative is to weaken this regime, this system, and eventually to help the Russian people to replace it with a democratic alternative. Otherwise, we're going to face problems for many years. But I don't think our leaders, either here in the States or in Europe or in Japan, are thinking for the long term. Unfortunately, we do not have statesmen now in the Western capitals and as well as Japan. We used to have them during the Cold War, but they're a dying breed. And this is exactly what people like Putin exploit.
Okay, well, I think we will wrap up at this point and say thank you to our three wonderful panelists for a terrific discussion.